Callista woke in a strange room, head pounding like a hammer against her skull, clothes disheveled, the scent of alcohol and men's cologne still lingering on the sheets. When she turned her head, the man lying beside her was not Henry, the fiancé she was about to marry, but William, his uncle. Her phone buzzed with dozens of missed calls. Her memory was broken into fragments. One haunting question echoed in her mind. Last night, what really happened? The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains, casting long shadows across a bedroom Callista had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket closer to her chest, trying to piece together the impossible scene before her. William remained asleep, his breathing steady and undisturbed, while Callista's entire world crumbled in silence. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But her body refused to cooperate. Every muscle felt weighted down by confusion and horror. Just 3 weeks earlier, everything had seemed perfect, almost too perfect in retrospect. Callista had been an ordinary girl from a middle-class background in suburban New Jersey, the daughter of a high school teacher and a small business owner. She had worked her way through state college, graduated with honors, and built a modest career in marketing for a nonprofit organization. She believed in the power of trust and the sanctity of commitment, values instilled by parents who had been married for 35 years. She had met Henry Moore at a charity gala where her organization was seeking donors. He had approached her at the silent auction, charming and self-deprecating, asking her opinion on a painting he was considering bidding on. They had talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing easily from art to literature to their shared love of Italian food. When he asked for her number at the end of the evening, Callista had been surprised and flattered. Their courtship had been everything she had imagined romance should be. Dinners at restaurants she could never have afforded on her own. Weekend trips to vineyards and art galleries. Henry sending flowers to her office with handwritten notes. He had seemed genuinely interested in her work, in her friends, in building a partnership rather than simply acquiring a wife. When he proposed 6 months later, on a rooftop overlooking the city at sunset, Callista had said yes without hesitation. She had fallen in love with Henry Moore not because of his family's prestigious name or their sprawling estate in Connecticut, but because he had seemed kind, attentive, and genuinely devoted to building a life with her. He remembered small details about her preferences. He called when he said he would. He introduced her to his friends with pride in his voice. Their engagement had been a fairy tale, at least on the surface. The kind of love story that made her friends sigh with envy. Henry came from old money, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. His family owned art galleries in Manhattan, investment portfolios that spanned continents, and a reputation that opened doors without knocking. To the outside world, the Moores were untouchable, gracious, and refined. Henry himself embodied this image perfectly, impeccably dressed, well-spoken, charming at dinner parties. But there had always been something elusive about him, a tendency to deflect whenever Callista asked too many questions about his childhood or his family dynamics. She had attributed it to privacy, to the natural reserve of someone raised in privilege. She had never imagined it might be something darker. William Moore was Henry's paternal uncle, though only 8 years older than his nephew. He lived alone in a converted loft in Brooklyn, kept to himself, and rarely attended family gatherings. The few times Callista had encountered him at Moore family events, his presence had been unsettling. Not threatening exactly, but observant in a way that made her feel exposed. His eyes seemed to look past the surface, past the polite conversation and rehearsed smiles, as if searching for something true underneath. Henry had always brushed off questions about William with vague explanations. "He's always been the black sheep," Henry would say with a dismissive wave. "Brilliant, but difficult. He and my father never got along." Callista had accepted this without pushing further. Every family had its complications, its members who didn't quite fit the mold. The bachelorette party had been planned for weeks. Audrey, Callista's best friend since college, had insisted on organizing everything. They had rented a luxury suite at a resort 2 hours upstate, invited a dozen close friends, and prepared for a weekend of celebration before Callista's wedding. The resort featured a spa, an infinity pool overlooking the mountains, and a bar that stayed open until midnight. Callista had been excited but also nervous. She had never been someone who enjoyed being the center of attention, and the idea of a bachelorette party felt performative in a way that made her uncomfortable. But she loved Audrey, and she wanted to honor the traditions that marked these transitions in life. So she had packed her bags, kissed Henry goodbye, and headed upstate with her friends. The atmosphere at the Moore estate in the days before the party had been strange. Helen Moore, Henry's mother, had been unusually attentive, asking Callista detailed questions about the party plans, who would be attending, where they were staying. At the time, Callista had thought Helen was simply being maternal, perhaps concerned about her future daughter-in-law's safety. Now, looking back, those questions took on a different tone. Henry himself had been distracted, frequently checking his phone, disappearing for private calls. When Callista asked if everything was all right, he assured her it was just work stress, nothing for her to worry about. She had believed him because she wanted to believe him, because doubt felt like a betrayal of the trust they had built together. The night of the party arrived with laughter and champagne toasts, the kind of joy that felt both celebratory and slightly desperate. Callista's friends had decorated the suite with white and gold balloons, metallic streamers, and fresh flowers. They had set up a playlist of their favorite songs from college, tracks that brought back memories of late-night study sessions. Someone had prepared elaborate cocktails with names like Last Night of Freedom and Future Mrs. Moore. Callista felt grateful, genuinely moved by the effort. She was surrounded by women who had known her for years, who had seen her through terrible breakups and career uncertainties. These were the people who knew her before Henry, before the Moore family name had become attached to hers. Around 9 in the evening, someone suggested they move to the resort bar. The suite felt too contained. They wanted music, dancing, the energy of other people celebrating. Callista agreed, slipping into a white cocktail dress that Audrey had picked out. The dress was more daring than her usual style, with a low back and delicate straps. The group descended on the bar, ordering rounds of drinks, pulling Callista onto the small dance floor despite her protests. For a while, everything felt right. The music was loud enough to drown out thought. The drinks were strong enough to soften anxiety. Callista danced with her friends, laughed at inside jokes, posed for countless photos. She felt, for those brief hours, like herself rather than Henry's fiancé. That was when everything began to blur, when the perfect evening began its collapse into nightmare. Callista remembered standing at the bar, ordering a second cocktail. Something fruity and sweet that masked the taste of alcohol. The bartender was a young man with a friendly smile who had been chatting with their group all evening. She remembered a stranger approaching from her left, a woman in a sleek black dress who seemed out of place among the more casually dressed resort guests. The woman had perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry, and she carried an extra drink in her manicured hand. From the bartender, the woman had said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, handing Callista the glass. For the bride-to-be, on the house. Callista had smiled, thanked her, and taken a sip without thinking. The drink tasted slightly off, bitter underneath the sweetness, like something had been added after the fact. But she had attributed it to an unfamiliar liquor, perhaps a premium vodka or gin she was not accustomed to. She had taken another sip, then another, not wanting to seem ungrateful for the gesture. Within 20 minutes, her head began to swim. The lights in the bar seemed too bright, then too dim. Sounds became distorted, voices stretching and warping like recordings played at the wrong speed. She tried to tell Audrey that something was wrong, but her tongue felt thick, her words slurred. Audrey looked concerned, asked if she had drunk too much, suggested they go back to the suite. Callista remembered nodding, or trying to nod. She remembered someone's hand on her elbow, guiding her through the bar. She remembered the cool night air hitting her face as they stepped outside. And then, nothing. A black void where memory should have been. The fragments that remained were like pieces of a shattered mirror, impossible to reassemble into a coherent picture. A deep voice calling her name. The interior of a car, leather seats, A streetlight passing overhead. The sensation of being carried. And then, darkness again. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, painfully. Callista became aware of her body before she became aware of her surroundings. Her head throbbed with a pain that radiated from the base of her skull. Her mouth was dry, tasting of copper and something chemical. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. She opened her eyes to find herself in a room she did not recognize. The walls were exposed brick, the furniture minimalist and modern. Gray morning light filtered through industrial-style windows. And beside her, in the bed, lay William Moore. The shock hit her like ice water. For several seconds, Callista could not move, could not breathe, could not process what she was seeing. This was not possible. This could not be real. She must still be dreaming, trapped in some nightmare, brought on by too much alcohol. But the pain in her head was real. The unfamiliar sheets beneath her were real. The sight of William's sleeping form, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, was horrifyingly, undeniably real. Callista sat up too quickly, and the room tilted. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. Her clothes from the night before lay crumpled on the floor. She was wearing a t-shirt she did not recognize, several sizes too large. Panic clawed at her throat. William stirred at the movement. His eyes opened, met hers, with an expression that was disturbingly calm. "You're awake," he said, his voice neutral, as if this were an ordinary morning. "What happened?" Callista's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. "What did you do?" William sat up slowly, maintaining a careful distance between them. "You don't remember?" "I don't remember anything." The words tasted like ash. "I was at the bar, and then, nothing. How did I get here? Why am I—" She could not finish the sentence. "You needed help," William said, his tone maddeningly even. "You were in trouble. I brought you here. That doesn't explain why I'm in your bed." "No." Callista's hands shook as she pulled the blanket higher. "What happened between us?" William's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composure. "You were here willingly." The word willingly hit Callista like a physical blow. She stared at him, searching for some sign of remorse, some indication that he understood how wrong this was. But his expression remained closed, unreadable. "I need to leave," Callista said, scrambling out of the bed. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she had to brace herself against the wall. William made no move to stop her. He simply watched as she gathered her belongings with trembling hands, as she stumbled toward the door. "Callista," he called as she reached the exit. She paused, but did not turn around. "You should know, it wasn't supposed to happen like this." She did not ask what he meant. She could not bear to know. The cab ride back to the resort felt like an eternity. Callista sat in the back seat, staring out the window without seeing anything. Her mind raced in circles, trying to understand, trying to remember, trying to make sense of the impossible. She checked her phone. 37 missed calls from Audrey, 15 from Henry, messages asking where she was, if she was safe. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on a simple lie. "I'm fine, needed some air. Be back soon." By the time she returned to the suite, most of her friends had checked out, assuming she had left early to see Henry. Only Audrey remained, pacing the room with worry etched across her face. "Where the hell were you?" Audrey demanded the moment Callista walked in. "You disappeared last night. I looked everywhere. I was about to call the police." "I'm sorry," Callista said automatically. I needed to clear my head." Audrey studied her friend's face with growing concern. "Cal, you look terrible. What happened?" "Nothing happened. I had too much to drink. I made a mistake." The lies came easier than expected, sliding off her tongue like well-rehearsed lines. But Audrey knew her too well. "That's bullshit. Tell me the truth." "I can't." The words escaped before Callista could stop them. "Please, Audrey. Just let it go." The drive back to the city was silent. Callista stared out the window. watching the landscape blur past, feeling the weight of what she could not say pressing down on her chest. When Audrey dropped her off at the apartment she shared with Henry, Callista almost told her everything. Almost. No. But shame sealed her lips. Henry greeted her at the door, with relief and irritation in equal measure. "You scared me," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt suffocating. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" "I'm sorry. I lost track of time." Another lie. Another layer of deception. Henry pulled back to look at her face. For a moment, Callista thought he could see through the facade that he would demand answers. But instead he simply kissed her forehead and said, "Get some rest. You look exhausted." The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Callista moved through her routine like a ghost, going to work, planning wedding details, smiling at appropriate moments. But inside, she was drowning. The guilt was relentless, a constant weight that made it hard to breathe. Every time Henry looked at her with trust in his eyes, the shame intensified. She could not look at him without seeing William's face in her mind. Could not let Henry touch her without flinching. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and Callista felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, paralyzed by the knowledge that one step in any direction would lead to disaster. William, mercifully, made himself scarce. He did not call, did not reach out, did not appear at family gatherings. But his absence was almost worse than his presence would have been, because it left Callista alone with her thoughts, with her questions, with the horrible uncertainty of what had actually happened that night. The nightmares began a week later. Callista would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, fragments of memories surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. The taste of that bitter drink, the sensation of being unable to move, voices she could not identify, and through it all, a persistent feeling that something was terribly fundamentally wrong. Audrey noticed the change. She called Callista repeatedly, insisting they needed to talk. But Callista put her off with excuses about wedding stress, about being busy with work. The truth was too complicated, too shameful to speak aloud. 2 weeks before the wedding, Callista woke up feeling violently ill. She barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting. Henry, concerned, suggested she see a doctor. Callista agreed, if only to have an excuse to leave the apartment, to escape the suffocating pretense of normalcy. Dr. Oliver Grant had been Callista's physician for 3 years, a calm and competent man in his early 50s. He conducted the examination with professional efficiency, asked questions about her symptoms, ordered blood work. "I want to run a full panel," he said, his tone careful, "just to rule out any underlying issues." Callista nodded, not thinking much of it. She assumed it was a virus, exhaustion, the stress of wedding planning. She went home, took the sick day Henry insisted she needed, and tried to sleep. 3 days later, Dr. Grant called and asked her to come back to the office. His voice on the phone was different, more serious. "I'd prefer to discuss the results in person," he said. The waiting room felt too bright, too sterile. Callista sat with her hands clenched in her lap, trying to ignore the anxiety building in her chest. When Dr. Grant finally called her back to his office, his expression was grave. "The blood work came back," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "And I found something concerning." Callista's heart stopped. "What is it?" Dr. Grant pulled up the results on his computer screen, though the numbers meant nothing to Callista. "There are traces of a substance in your system. A sedative hypnotic, to be specific. The kind of drug that causes temporary memory loss and impaired motor function." The words did not immediately register. Callista stared at him, uncomprehending. "I don't understand." "What does that mean?" "It means, Dr. Grant said gently, that you were drugged. Recently, within the past 2 to 3 weeks. The room tilted. Callista gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles turning white. "That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is. The drug in question is commonly known as a date rape drug. It's designed to render someone compliant and unable to remember what happens while under its influence." Callista felt as if the floor had opened beneath her. Everything she had believed about that night, Every explanation she had constructed, every layer of guilt and shame she had wrapped around herself, suddenly shifted. "I was drugged," she repeated, the words foreign in her mouth. "Yes. I'm required by law to ask if you want to file a police report. If something happened to you while you were incapacitated." "No." The word came out too quickly, too forcefully. "No police. I need to think." Dr. Grant's expression was sympathetic. "I understand this is a shock, but Callista, if someone did this to you, they need to be held accountable. I know. I just need time." She stood on shaking legs. "Thank you for telling me." The walk home was a blur. Callista's mind raced with implications, with questions that had no easy answers. If she had been drugged, then what happened that night was not her fault. She had not betrayed Henry willingly. She had been a victim, not a perpetrator. But that knowledge brought no relief. Only a deeper, more terrifying set of questions. Who had drugged her? Why? And what exactly had William's role been in all of this? When she arrived home, Callista went straight to her laptop and began researching. She read articles about date rape drugs, about their effects, about how they were administered. Everything she read matched her experience. The sudden onset of disorientation, the memory loss, the physical symptoms. Then she called Audrey. "I need your help," Callista said when her friend answered. "And I need you not to ask questions until I'm finished talking." There was a pause, then Audrey's voice, steady and certain. "I'm listening." Callista told her everything. The night of the party, waking up at Williams, the doctor's diagnosis. She spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, reciting facts as if they had happened to someone else. When she finished, silence filled the line. "We're going to find out who did this," Audrey finally said, her voice hard with anger. "Whatever it takes." They started with the resort, approaching the investigation carefully. Audrey called the bar, asking to speak with the manager while claiming she had left her credit card there the night of the party. When she got someone on the phone, she casually mentioned wanting to thank the bartender who had sent the bride a complimentary drink. "Do you remember who was working that night?" Audrey asked, her voice friendly and unconcerned. The manager checked the schedule. 3 bartenders had been on duty that evening: Marcus, Jennifer, and Kyle. Audrey wrote down their names, thanking the manager before immediately searching for them on social media. Next, she asked about security cameras. The resort had them throughout the property, including in the bar area. But footage was only kept for 2 weeks before being recorded over. They were too late by almost a full week. The evidence, if there had been any, was gone. Callista tried to piece together her memories from that night, forcing herself to relive moments she wanted desperately to forget. She wrote down every detail she could recall. The woman in the black dress handing her the drink had worn expensive jewelry, real diamonds rather than costume pieces. Her dress had been designer. She had not looked like a typical resort guest. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, who had paid her to be there? Callista also remembered something else. Just before the woman approached, she had seen someone watching her from across the bar. A man in a dark suit, despite the casual atmosphere. Their eyes had met for just a moment before he looked away. Had he been coordinating with the woman in black? The more Callista thought about it, the more she realized how carefully orchestrated the entire evening had been. Someone had known where she would be, what time her party would arrive, even what she looked like. This was not random. This was targeted, planned, executed with precision. Then there was William. His calm demeanor when she woke up, his insistence that she had been there willingly, his cryptic comment that things were not supposed to happen like this. What had he meant? Had he known about the plan beforehand? Audrey pulled records of Henry's credit card statements, information Callista had access to since they had been planning to merge finances. Nothing obvious stood out at first, but then Audrey noticed a payment to a private investigation firm 3 weeks before the party. $5,000, with a notation that simply read, "Consultation." "What kind of consultation costs $5,000?" Audrey asked. The kind where you're hiring someone to do something illegal, Callista replied, her stomach turning. 3 days before the wedding, Helen Moore invited Callista to lunch. It was presented as a bonding opportunity, a chance for the future mother-in-law and daughter-in-law to connect before the ceremony. Callista almost declined, but something made her accept. Perhaps it was curiosity, or a growing suspicion that the answers she needed were closer than she realized. They met at an upscale bistro in Midtown. Helen arrived precisely on time, dressed in a cream-colored suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. She greeted Callista with air kisses and immediately launched into conversation about the wedding arrangements, the guest list, the honeymoon plans. But there was something performative about Helen's cheerfulness, something that did not reach her eyes. Callista found herself studying the older woman's face, looking for cracks in the facade. "You seem troubled, dear," Helen said eventually, setting down her wine glass. "Is everything all right?" The question felt like a test. Callista chose her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately, about how well we really know the people closest to us." Helen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. A philosophical mood. "How interesting. I saw William a few weeks ago," Callista said, watching Helen's reaction. "At the resort where my bachelorette party was held." Helen's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Fear. Guilt? "William travels quite a bit. I'm sure it was coincidental, was it?" Callista leaned forward, because it felt very deliberate. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken understanding. Helen took a slow sip of her wine, then set the glass down with exaggerated care. "Some things are better left unexamined, Callista. For everyone's sake. Even when those things involve crimes?" Helen's facade finally cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know I was drugged. I know your brother-in-law was involved. And I know this family is hiding something." "Now." Callista's voice remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "So I'm asking you directly, what happened that night?" Helen stood abruptly, gathering her purse. "This conversation is over. I suggest you focus on your future with my son rather than chasing conspiracy theories." But as Helen walked away, Callista caught something in her expression. Not defiance, but desperation. The look of someone trying to protect a secret that was already unraveling. That evening, William called. Callista stared at her phone for 3 rings before answering. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "In person." "I don't think that's a good idea. It's necessary. There are things you need to know before you marry Henry." His voice was different now. Urgent, rather than detached. "Things I should have told you weeks ago." Against her better judgment, Callista agreed to meet him. They chose a coffee shop in neutral territory, far from anywhere the Moore family might frequent. William was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table, his expression troubled. Callista sat down across from him, her posture rigid. "Talk. William took a breath, as if steeling himself. "That night at the resort, you were targeted. The drug in your system wasn't random. Someone at that party was paid to slip it into your drink." The confirmation of what Callista had suspected still hit like a punch. "By who?" "That's complicated." William ran a hand through his hair. "Henry's been under a lot of pressure from his parents to marry someone from an appropriate background. When he proposed to you, there was resistance. Concerns about your family's social standing, your lack of connections. So they decided to what? Test me? Sabotage me?" Henry had doubts about your loyalty. Stupid, baseless doubts planted by people who should have known better. Nor. William's voice was bitter. He wanted to see if you would remain faithful even in a compromised state. So he arranged for you to be drugged, put in a situation where you might be vulnerable to someone else's advances. The betrayal was so enormous that Callista could barely process it. "He drugged me. His own fiancé. To test my faithfulness. I found out about the plan too late to stop it. But I was there at the resort, trying to make sure things didn't go as far as Henry intended. When I saw you stumbling out of the bar, barely conscious, I took you away from there. I brought you to my apartment to keep you safe." "Not sure," But you didn't just keep me safe, did you? Callista's voice shook. You crossed a line. William's face was haggard. Yes, I did. And I will regret that for the rest of my life. I told myself I was protecting you from something worse, but in doing so, I became part of the harm. There's no excuse for what I did. Callista felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Did Henry know about what happened between us? No. That part was never part of his plan. He was supposed to have someone approach you, try to seduce you while you were drugged and film your reaction. Blackmail material, or proof of your unworthiness, depending on how you responded. I disrupted that plan, but I made things worse in my own way. The full scope of the betrayal was staggering. The man she had agreed to marry had orchestrated her assault, all to satisfy his own insecurity. And the man who had supposedly saved her had violated her trust in the process. I need to confront Henry, Callista said, standing up. Are you sure you're ready for that? I've never been more ready for anything in my life. The confrontation happened at the apartment she had shared with Henry for the past year. Callista walked in to find him reviewing seating charts for the wedding reception, completely absorbed in mundane details, while her world burned. We need to talk, she said, her voice cold. Henry looked up, smiling. About the reception? I was thinking we should move your aunt's table closer to, about the fact that you drugged me. The smile froze on Henry's face. He set down the seating chart with deliberate slowness. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. Not anymore. Callista's hands were shaking, but her voice remained steady. I know about the plan. About the test. About everything you did. Henry's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, more calculating. Who told you? Does it matter? You admit it then. It was supposed to be harmless. Henry stood, moving toward her with placating gestures. Just a way to verify that you were truly committed to me, to us. My parents insisted. Your parents. Callista laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Of course, because poisoning your future wife is completely reasonable if your parents suggest it. The drug was mild. You were never in any real danger. I woke up in another man's bed with no memory of how I got there. I've spent weeks drowning in guilt over something I had no control over. And you're telling me I was never in danger? Callista's voice rose despite her attempts to stay calm. You violated every boundary of trust and decency. You turned me into a victim of your own paranoia. Henry's facade finally cracked, revealing anger underneath. If you had nothing to hide, nothing would have happened. That's not how consent works. That's not how any of this works. Callista pulled the engagement ring from her finger and set it on the table between them. The wedding is off. You're being hysterical. Once you calm down, I am perfectly calm. And I am done. With you, with your family, with all of this. She gathered the few belongings she had brought when moving in, stuffing them into a bag with shaking hands. Henry watched her, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been regret. Where will you go? Somewhere you'll never find me. The scandal that followed was ugly and public. Callista filed a police report about being drugged, though she knew the statute of limitations and lack of evidence would prevent prosecution. But she told her story anyway, to friends, to family members, to anyone who asked why the wedding had been canceled so abruptly. The Moore family tried to contain the damage, spreading their own narrative about Callista being unstable, vindictive, a gold digger who had gotten cold feet. But Audrey, fierce and loyal, made sure the truth spread just as fast. Social circles whispered, gossip columns hinted, and slowly, the Moore family's pristine reputation developed cracks. William left the city entirely, sending Callista a letter before he went. In it, he apologized again, acknowledged his guilt, and promised to seek help for the impulses that had led him to cross boundaries he should have respected. Callista burned the letter after reading it. Apologies could not undo what had been done. Weeks turned into months. Callista moved into her own apartment, something small and affordable, but entirely hers. She went to therapy, worked through the trauma, learned to separate shame from victimhood. The process was slow, painful, and necessary. Audrey was there through all of it, a constant presence in the chaos. They spent hours talking, processing, sometimes just sitting in silence while Callista pieced herself back together. A year after the canceled wedding, Callista sat in a cafe near her new apartment, drinking coffee and reading. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and golden. She had cut her hair short, changed careers to something that felt more authentic, built a life that belonged solely to her. Her phone buzzed with a message from Audrey. "Coffee tomorrow? I have news about a certain family whose art gallery is under investigation for fraud." Callista smiled. Karma, it seemed, had its own timeline. She thought about the person she had been a year ago, desperate for approval, willing to ignore warning signs in pursuit of a fairy tale ending. That version of herself felt like a stranger now. The Callista who existed today was harder, more cautious, but also freer. She had learned that love built on deception was no love at all, that trust once shattered could not be forced back together with apologies and excuses. Sometimes, late at night, she still had nightmares about waking up in that unfamiliar room. But more often now, she dreamed of flying, of open roads, of possibilities that belonged entirely to her. Callista closed her book and looked out the window at the city stretching before her. She had not been saved by love, had not been rescued by anyone but herself. And that, she had learned, was the only kind of salvation worth having. The question that had haunted her that first terrible morning, what really happened, had been answered. But the question that mattered more, who will I become after this, was still unfolding, one choice at a time. She stood, gathered her things, and walked out into the autumn afternoon. The future was uncertain, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.